Welcome, explorers of the world's great mysteries. I'm Doug Kenyon, editor and publisher of Atlantis Rising magazine. We call this program simply Conversations, and we feature the many great contributors to our publication, world-class researchers who dare to follow real evidence where it leads and let the chips fall where they may. In just a moment, we'll be talking to author and Knights Templar expert Steve Sora. But first, for those of you unfamiliar with Atlantis Rising magazine, let me introduce you to our publication. Focusing on ancient mysteries, unexplained anomalies, and future science, Atlantis Rising has for many years provided a serious forum for alternative ideas of prehistory, science, and culture. Ideas which, when not entirely ignored by the mainstream press, are yet seldom treated with the respect they deserve. Our magazine appears bi-monthly in printed form, and you can find it on stands in most major chain bookstores, such as Barnes & Noble, Hastings, Books A Million, etc. And it's also available from many New Age outlets and independent stores. If your favorite magazine dealer doesn't carry it, ask why. For iPad users, our free app can be found at the Apple App Store. Postal subscriptions are also available worldwide, and you can get it in PDF form on an issue-by-issue basis directly from our website at atlantisrising.com. Among the many great articles in our May-June 2014 issue is an eye-opening story by investigative reporter Patrick Marsalek. It's called Lost Tribes, and it's about the enduring search for the lost heirs of the biblical Jacob. Some of the latest research, including DNA tracking, may startle you. Then there's Morphic Fields and DNA by William B. Stecker, Why Life on Earth is Not Explained by Genetics Alone. In challenging the illusion of death, Cynthia Logan has a game-changing conversation with top biologist Robert Lanza. And in Pathological Skepticism, leading psychiatrist Dr. D.W. Krieger explains why some minds will never open. And you'll also find a very exciting piece by our current guest. Stephen Sora is a leading expert on the notorious Oak Island mystery, which has been the subject of a recent reality series and several documentaries. In 1999, he published the widely read and frequently quoted Lost Treasure of the Knights Templar. He's also written Lost Colony of the Templars, Secret Societies of America's Elite, Triumph of the Sea Gods, Treasures from Heaven, and over 100 articles. He's a frequent guest in documentaries dealing with ancient mysteries and lost history. His website is at templartreasure.com. Steve lives on Long Island. Welcome to Atlantis Rising Conversation, Steve.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
In your article for the May-June Atlantis Rising, Templar Treasure and the Forbidden Island, you talk about the famous Sinclair family, whose role in Knights, Templar, and Freemasonic history can't be overstated. Dan Brown, author of the best-selling Da Vinci Code, was among those connecting the family with an actual bloodline going back to Jesus and Mary Magdalene. In your article, though, you credit them with having at one time an actual family navy. That was an important force on the world stage, and you make some connections with your Oak Island story. Could you explain that?
One of the first mentions I ever got on the Sinclair family was in a book by Frederick Powell called Prince Henry Sinclair. And he wasn't really a prince, but he was written up that way. Prince Henry Sinclair in 1398 made a voyage across the Atlantic. He landed in Nova Scotia, and he explored certain areas that were all recorded by a fellow adventurer, Nicholas Zeno. The records of this turned up in the 1600s, and they accurately describe a lot of different features of the Nova Scotian landscape. The last we heard from Henry was that he was going back to Nova Scotia to start a colony. And at the time, he was an heir to a Viking dynasty that went back to the 800s. He was considered the ruler of northern Scotland, the Caithness area, where there's still Sinclair castles today. His property took in, of course, Roslin in Edinburgh, and he also had to show a force on a regular basis to keep some of the other Viking territories in line. He owned the Orkneys, and so he would take his ships, kind of a great white fleet, and travel around the Orkneys on a regular basis. And later on, from when he took over that land, his family had become the hereditary guardians of the Freemasons, which were kind of an outgrowth of the Knights Templar. During the Templar years, his fleet had built up, and the Templar fleet became his own. So at one time, yes, he was the greatest fleet owner in the world.
So, and you make a connection between this fleet and various explorations to various islands around the world in the story.
That's right, and his family was actually from a Viking called Rollo. Rollo came to France, and he literally lifted King Charles up and set him on his backside, and basically was granted a whole bunch of land in what is now called Normandy. And they were explorers right from the beginning. The family also took place in the Battle of Hastings in 1066, when the Norsemen then played a huge role in conquering England. And they regularly did a lot of exploring. It was an Orkney fisherman that actually sailed to America before 1398. And while we always point to Columbus as being the first one there, a lot of fishermen came over to the Grand Banks, and they would have shacks in places like Nova Scotia and the St. Lawrence River, and fish for cod, dry them out, and then return home with them. So this Orkney fisherman was one of his subjects as the ruler of the Orkneys, came back and told him about all this different adventures he had there, which he seemed to have gone up and down the coast of the Atlantic. So this is why Henry Sinclair mounted an expedition to kind of follow up on that. Now the Vikings had already been sailing to the Faroes, then another 3-day stop, and they'd make it over to Greenland and Iceland, and finally the Americas. So they weren't unknown to that area, and they kept their own tradition of knowing the way to the Americas. It was just at one time a rich land to bring back lumber from, and in other cases it was a great fishing grounds. So I believe that even before the Orkney fisherman told Henry the story, he was already had that knowledge of the Americas.
Well, in the Da Vinci Code, as well as the best-selling Holy Blood, Holy Grail, we learn about a mysterious treasure said to be discovered by an obscure parish priest in the Languedoc area of southern France, and it's suggested that it contained relics which could destroy the church, and connections were made with Scotland's Roslin Chapel and so forth. And I'm wondering, does any of this story, particularly the idea of a lost treasure, make any connection with your Oak Island story?
It does. In Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they first brought out the secret organization that was kind of a core to the Knights Templar, which was called the Priory of Sion. And the second Grand Master of the Priory of Sion was actually Marie de Sinclair, which is the Sinclair name in France. And when they went to Jerusalem, the whole story of the Knights Templar goes that first it was 9 knights that stayed there almost a decade, and instead of really protecting the roads for pilgrims, they spent a lot of time excavating Jerusalem, specifically Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. And they did bring home, in some cases, literature treasures, books that got translated for the first time in Europe, gold and silver most likely. Some people believe that the Ark of the Covenant came home with them, and so they're credited with all these treasures. Some of the treasures had already moved to Sinclair provinces in the south of France, and this could be the lands where Father Saunier was teaching and preaching, actually.
He's the
also
priest,
some of the treasure may have made it into the Paris Temple. From the Paris Temple, October 13, 1307, the French king decided it was time to end the Knights Templar because they were getting too big and too wealthy, and he needed the money. But the Knights Templar probably also had the greatest intelligence force in the world, as great as their fighting force. They were tipped off in advance, and a whole bunch of wagon trains carried treasure to a handful of ships in La Rochelle, and the treasure, I believe, then went to certain other places, including Scotland, where it would have ended up in Sinclair hands.
So, what kind of evidence do you have that, well, particularly that those who built Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland could have explored America before Columbus?
Well, it was interesting that in 1441 is when Rosslyn was supposed to have started getting built, and the Sinclairs invited a huge amount of Masons to start the work there. And Masons at this time were not just people that were descended from, say, Knights Templar, but they were actually craft Masons that did building work. It was actually 5 years between when they enlisted these people and when they actually started work. And I believe it was that time that Henry Sinclair took them over to Nova Scotia. They built what became the money pit on Oak Island, and they had the art of hydraulics and the ability to build a complex complete with booby traps that they did build. So
you want to describe describe the situation there on Oak Island for people, because some people may not be familiar with exactly what it is we're talking about there.
Oak Island is sort of shaped like an 8, with the middle not being as pinched as the number 8, but in the middle of it there's Smith's Cove on one side and there's another cove on the other side. Between them there's a shaft that goes down. It was started being excavated in 1795 when 3 young men discovered that there was a depression in the ground and a tree near it with a tackle block hanging over it. So they dug down 3 feet. There were flagstones there, which are not indigenous to the area. They dug down 10 feet, and there was an oaken platform. They were able to get to 20 feet and to 30 feet, where, again, oaken platforms were in the way. And finally, they had to give up. A few years later, a company, they call it a syndicate in Nova Scotia, took over the dig, and they've continued it down to 30, 40, 50, all the way down to 90 feet. At 90 feet, some men went to inspect it one Sunday morning and everything looked okay, and they came back from church and went to inspect it again and start work. The whole thing flooded, and what it ended up would be from the shaft itself going sideways out to Smith's Cove and the other cove. It was like these tunnels that would funnel in water at some point. I guess when they got to a certain depth, it triggered these things. And how they found that out was they put red dye and dynamite in it, and it sent out the red dye on both sides of the island. They excavated around one side of it, and they found that there were actually drains and different tunnels that were these booby traps, and the drains themselves were covered with eelgrass and coconut husks, which kind of prevented them from getting clogged. Fast forward 200 years, they still haven't been able to make any progress. We've recently seen the special on TV where they're trying different places on the island, and they found a Spanish coin, but I think that's really not what was there. I think the treasure, 50% chance of having been moved, and there's the Sinclair family, it's very possible, still controls that treasure.
Now, a lot of famous people have been very interested in the entire Oak Island possibility, treasure-wise, I guess, including Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt helped part of the dig, and he actually went to Oak Island. Errol Flynn was one of the people that invested in trying to find the treasure of Oak Island. And for most people, it's just been an adventure. They got a little bit of gold chain. They got a tiny parchment with a couple letters on it. With a camera, more recently, there's evidence that there was a severed hand all the way at the bottom. But certainly, it's been a money pit, and all the money's been going in, and nothing's been coming out.
Well, you know, in the 2004 movie National Treasure, starring Nicolas Cage, the story is that the Templars and the Masons who founded America had left a secret stash, including all kinds of important relics from the Holy Grail to the Ark of the Covenant. Do you think that that story could have any basis in fact, or in other words, doesn't it seem like a kind of parallel with what might be, what you think might be on Oak Island?
I do, and I think there's numerous other places in the United States where some of these treasures have been hidden. And Sir Francis Bacon is really interesting because he was under kind of a cloud of the Queen that he couldn't really write and get away with it. Like his New Atlantis, he made sure that was not published till he died. And he had all these other writings, many believe including the works of Shakepeare and other secrets. He had actually founded in 1586 it's called the Brothers of the Rosy Cross, and that at that time it's when he started writing things like the Fama Fraternitas, which are the basic works in Rosicrucianism. And so his works, I think, came over to Virginia, where they were buried in a vault near Williamsburg called the Bruton Vault. And that was one of the theories of where some of these treasures are. There is, according to one group, there's over 100 different places that things are hidden in the United States. In Pennsylvania, it's really interesting that the movie had something to do with Pennsylvania, and right after that, I got a phone call from somebody that said in Reading, Pennsylvania, there was a bar called the Temple of the Knights of Solomon, and this was around from colonial times, and it was on a line from Allentown to Ephrata. Ephrata was a Rosicrucian center. These people called themselves Pietists, but it was the same Sir Francis Bacon Rosicrucianism that they practiced there. And they had a lot to do with printing the original Declaration of Independence and some of the other pamphlets that went around. And so this person called me up and he said, in the movie, halfway between Allentown and Ephrata, there's these different places, including the Temple of Solomon Tavern. And he took me to a church there, and the church was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And I had just visited Roslyn a few years before, and it was like a church in the Pennsylvania countryside that the altar was like a Freemasonic, two pillars in front of the altar. All the designs were Rosicrucian, like anchors and things like that throughout the church. And most churches are consecrated on a day other than Friday. This had been consecrated on Friday, December 21st, so it was the solstice. So it was really interesting. I don't know of any legend connecting the church, but he says at Ephrata there's a whole secret history there. And so I believe that there are other places. They just, may never turn up.
Well, back to the exploration, the seafaring kinds of exploration. I'm wondering, how much did the early explorers know about the Atlantic and what might lie on the other side from Europe? Were they really afraid of sailing off the edge of the world as we've been taught?
No, I think it was from 200 AD on that at least the Greeks understood that the world was round, and that you wouldn't fall off at any point. I think a lot of people were very superstitious, and so it's very possible that sailors aboard Columbus's ships were afraid something terrible was going to happen as they just kept heading west. But I think people of learning would have understood that the world was round. But it's interesting, Columbus made this voyage, and he said he was going to China or India, and he bore gifts for the Maharajas or the Mandarins, and yet at the same time they were bells and trinkets, which China at that time was probably way ahead of us with all those type of goodies. So it was like he knew he was visiting uncivilized people, I believe, and or maybe that's not the right word, but certainly not as civilized as China was. And interesting story, when Henry Sinclair came over in 1398, his daughter was Elizabeth. Elizabeth married a person named John Drummond. John Drummond's family was the single richest family in Scotland at that time. And so the second son always has to fend for himself, where the first son always inherits everything. So John went to Madeira. On Madeira, he met the family of Columbus. Columbus had married a Felipa de Perestrello, who was, her father was like an admiral in the Knights of Christ, and specifically charged with finding islands in the Atlantic. So and Columbus was given as a wedding gift all the maps and charts of Admiral Perestrello. So a very interesting gift for someone that wants to be a map maker or a navigator. And Sinclair is actually married into the Perestrello family, the heirs of Elizabeth and John. So there's, on such a tiny place, it's, you know, it would almost be impossible for them not to have met each other, and very likely did a little note swapping, since both the Sinclairs and Columbus were interested in navigation there. And later on, Henry Sinclair had said he was going to start a colony, went back to the Americas, and then disappeared from history. A lot of people believe that that colony is at Newport. At Newport, Rhode Island, is this Cistercian-style church, which actually can measure the solstices, measure the what's called the Metonic cycle, where the sun and the moon meet every 19 years. And it had to be men of science like the Templars that would build that. So when Verrazano came over looking for this in 1524, the first stop that he made was the island of Madeira, and stayed there a few days, and then sailed to the Americas. The only place he spent any time was in Newport, and when he left, his map described the place as the Refugio, the refuge, and Henry Templar had built it as a refuge for the ex-Templars.
Is that where the Newport Tower is? Or
yes.
Tell us about that. That's quite a construction.
It's really interesting. The first time I was sitting in work one day at 9 o'clock in the morning reading the newspaper, and they said the Viking ships are coming to Newport. So I scooped up my kids and took a ride there from New York City. And the Vikings are credited with being there, and a lot of people call it the Viking Tower. But Vikings didn't leave such monuments. Like, I visited where the Vikings landed in Newfoundland, and it was a working farm and a working, they built ships there or repaired them. There was nothing like the Newport Tower there. The Newport Tower is 8-sided. It's like an octagon in a circle, and it has, it's 2 stories. Once upon a time it had a roof and very tiny windows in odd places. And some people say those windows might have been used for shooting out of if they were attacked or anything like that. But it was there before any colonists came. And of course it was on Verrazano's map as he called it the Norman Tower. And so just in recent years, a person named Jim Egan, who's a photographer, has been there every equinox and solstice and taken photographs. And with another expert on archaeoastronomy, they figured out that all these different windows were there to measure different things at important dates on the calendar. So, in fact, I'm going to be up there in about 2 weeks. They're going to be doing a demonstration there. So I really believe that Henry Sinclair landed there. That was his monument. And there's actually on the map of Verrazano, there's a little knight. And so it's definitely pointing to a place where Henry Sinclair, long before Francis Bacon, was also looking to create a utopia in the New World, a new Atlantis or whatever.
Well, where did the Templars get their, the navigators, get their expertise? Did they have access to secret charts? And if they did, where did the charts come from?
You know, in discussing this topic, it was, I looked back, and as far as my own notes go, it was the Phoenicians that really since, 1000 BC, they were sailing into the Atlantic, and they would do anything to keep their secrets. And I think some of that knowledge would just pass down through the generations in secret, and it was never shared. And I think, going to the days of the Templars and beyond, the maps that they showed in those days, the portolan maps, portolan meaning from port to port, were good descriptive things. If you were sailing from, say, one point on the Mediterranean coast to another, it would give a description. What they don't really show is longitudinal latitude. but they do pick certain centers, and from there they call them some kind of like compass point that, you know, later became latitude and longitude. And they also, before that, they were able to read the stars. The first charts of the world were star charts. And so I think if you had a combination of something like a Portolano and a star chart, it was definitely much better to navigate than just having one. And the Templars, their science was all over, as far as when people returned from the Crusades, all of a sudden the advancement of science in Europe was great, and the Templars were one that may have served in bringing home those sciences and then putting them to work.
My understanding is, though, that some of the there's some new research that I've been looking at regarding the Portolans, and that there was a lot of that evidence that they understood how to make projections that involve a curved surface like the Earth, and that's what accounts for the accuracy of some of the locations. It's something that's kind of anomalous in terms of, but it reminded me of some of the things that Charles Hapgood has talked about, and I'm thinking particularly about some of his the Piri-Reis map, for example, and it's showing the coast of Antarctica beneath the ice, and some of those things. I don't know what your position is on some of that, but it strikes me that there you have evidence that goes back further than the Phoenicians.
It, you know, when this was discussed, one of the things that I remember from Charles Bailey's Sea Gods book was that they were mining copper in Michigan going back to 3000 BC. And one of the people mentioned in the article that you sent was he actually said that the golden age of seafaring, up till now, of course, was 3000 BC to 1500 BC, which kind of fits in that period when they were mining copper, and it kind of ends when the copper mining had stopped in Michigan. And there are some people who believe this copper was coming back to Europe because through the Bronze Age it was needed. It was more important than even silver. So what happened in 1500 BC, it could have been that the Minoan Empire, which was certainly adept at seafaring, collapsed when the earthquakes that took place in the Mediterranean basically brought an end to their power. So there could be something that was passed along from those days, although connecting the dots, I'm not able to do.
Well, I don't mean to put you on the spot there, but it's been said, and I've heard it argued in many people, that the pirates were actually Templars after the involved in lashing back at the destruction of the Templars there. Do you think there's anything to that?
Quite a lot to it. I think in the days when the Templars controlled the Mediterranean, half of the things that people did were act as merchants, and half were at the same time, when it was easy to steal somebody else's ship, why trade for it? So they were pirates during that time. And the Templars believed that all you need is a skull and 2 bones to actually bury somebody, that they would be prepared for the resurrection. And so the Jolly Roger, I think, is based on that skull and crossbones motif that the Templar graves have and still do. And why they took to the sea is because in France it was a Catholic country, and if we remember, like St. Bartholomew's Day, it was like 30,000 French Protestants were killed on the same day, and the Catholic Church applauded it. They kind of got confined to La Rochelle, and La Rochelle stayed a Huguenot stronghold forever. Both from sea and land, it's a hard place to take. From the sea, they actually extend chains from one part of the harbor to another. So all they have to do is pull up the chains, and an invading ship can't get in. That's where the Templar stronghold was as well, and where the Templar ships left with the treasure that they saved from the Temple of Paris. So a lot of Huguenots, a lot of the early pirates were Huguenots, and I have no doubt that they were Templars or ex-Templars in different organizations, different secret societies that supported each other.
Just to review for people, the port at La Rochelle is where the Templar fleet was positioned, which apparently got away before the King Philip's forces could get there, and were never seen again.
That's right, and some people said that was a myth. Yet in Templar testimony, there was a small inquisition in England, and two separate Templars, not under the threat of torture because they weren't doing that in England. They both told the story of how the ships were loaded up with everything from the Temple that was valuable and brought to Scotland. It was very interesting because at once the Templars became excommunicated, and at the same time Scotland as a country became excommunicated. What had happened was Robert Bruce fought for the independence of Scotland. It's really an interesting story. He had one rival that was basically backed by the church and by the English, and he met his rival in the Greyfriars Chapel and stabbed him, and his best friend or whatever, Kirkpatrick, came in, and he said, I stabbed Comyn the Red, and he says, is he dead? And he goes, and Sinclair and Robert the Bruce said, I'm not sure. He says, well, I'll make sure. And then he stabbed him again and left the body on the altar, and it was one of the most horrific things. So the Pope then excommunicated Robert the Bruce, but the whole country as well. And at that time, you were made an outlaw, so the Templars could be hunted down and killed. No one had to justify killing a Templar, and anybody from Scotland, theoretically, could be hunted down and killed. So they were a perfect fit for each other. And at the Battle of Bannockburn a few years later, we remember from movies the Scots were always coming out with rocks and sticks and spears and everything, and they were fighting this massive British army. Well, in this case, the Scots were started to get beaten back, and all of a sudden a fresh cavalry rode out from the woods, and people believe that was the Templars in hiding in Scotland, and they beat back the English in the first huge victory of Scotland over England, and that became Scottish independence.
Well, what do you see as of course, the Templars gave birth to the Freemasons. At least that's the official line there. What was their agenda, and does it still operate? And where did that agenda come from? What do you think about that?
Well, part of the agenda, I think, was just as they were a large force together, and in those days people didn't even travel, so being one outlaws and being two strangers, and often in strange lands, they had to stick together. And they were also known as builders. Like they built many of the cathedrals in Europe. They built little things like bridges that still stand today. And so what would happen when, say, 1,000 men were needed to come to one place to build a cathedral? They were strangers and they had to be protected. So what would happen? They created the lodge system. And the lodge system is known less in Templarism than it is in Freemasonry. Every town has a Freemason lodge now. And what would happen is a man could go to a lodge, identify himself as being on the level or being the son of a widow, and whatever the code words they were using at the time, and he could expect to, A, have a place to stay, B, have food, and 3, get a job. And so he would work on the cathedral, and even though he was he was a stranger in that land, he was protected by the lodge system. And this system existed even in the American Revolution. George Washington was one of the first to create what they called the movable lodge, and most of the war he spent retreating, but wherever they ended up, they would have a tent that was devoted to a lodge. They would have lodge meetings, and just about everybody that Washington promoted was somebody that could be trusted. In other words, he was on the level, and so he was admitted to the lodge then.
You want to tell us a little bit more about the involvement of the Freemasons in the building of America there?
Well, it's very much interconnected with what was going on in England and the United States. There were certain people that, they wanted this new Atlantis. They wanted a land that there was going to be religious freedom and things like that. And even though most of the Freemasons were now Protestants, because the Catholic Church had kind of abandoned them, to say the least, the agenda was the same, that we would have a nation where science, religion, all of these things weren't regulated by one organization who would just as soon put someone to death for coming up with a new idea. We had Galileo imprisoned as an old man. We had Bruno, who was burned at the stake for his ideas that the sun was central to the universe. We had Copernicus that was afraid to publish till after he was dead. And the goal of the Freemason organization, and specifically Francis Bacon and the Rosicrucian, was that this wouldn't happen in the new country. We would have these inalienable freedoms, and we wouldn't be under the rule of a king. And so it was a very strong force and a very strong ideal that even though not everything was for religion or freedom of science or whatever, but some of it was just able to do business by yourself. A great example is John Hancock. John Hancock was in one lodge that was a working man's lodge, and you would be a shipwright or someone that made rope or whatever, and you would go to those lodge meetings. And then he was in another lodge with just people that were ship owners. So he was, living with one foot into both worlds. The benefit to him was that he would only have people that worked for him that way were Masons, because they were pledged to each other. And so when a customs agent got on his ship and started to look for things that should have been taxed, his men might lock him up in a room, empty the ship of all its goods, and then let the person out. And if you were on the level, again, if you were a member, you could be trusted to do that and not to rat on your boss, John Hancock. And so he was, of course, the largest signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was not, he was very outspoken as far as the way he thought things should be. And some people, like Benjamin Franklin, I think were just honest in the way that he had connections. He was in several different lodges, including the Lodge of the Nine Sisters. He was present when they inducted Voltaire into that lodge in France. And his important contribution was in rallying a lot of people to come over and help the Americans in the War of Independence. Some people believe as many as half of the signers of the Declaration were Freemasons, so they definitely played a very important role.
In Atlantis Rising's March-April issue, you wrote The Man Who Could Not Be King, and you tell the story of Francis Bacon, and who you believe was the son of Queen Elizabeth I, and thus heir to the British throne. You tell how he worked behind the scenes to set the stage for America. Can you tie this story in with the Templar and Masonic agendas that you've been talking about?
Well, the first thing that he formed was when he was in school, and I guess it was law school at a place called Gray's Inn. He formed the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. From there, part of that brotherhood was the modern Freemasonry that never really kind of came out of the closet until 1717, but one of the different levels in Freemasonry was his Rosy Cross step, and he had a few secret organizations that grew out of that. He was afraid to come public with it because he was in a very awkward position. Close friends of his were executed for performing Shakespeare plays that, knocked the monarchy. Why I believe that he was the son of Elizabeth and is because there was a person named Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Robert and Queen Elizabeth, before she was queen, grew up together, and she was a threat to the throne. At one point, she thought she was going to be executed. Both of them were put in a tower, and they kind of studied together and everything and grew up, and they were in love. Elizabeth, however, was not allowed to, there were two forces in England. She was afraid to get married because both of these forces were opposed to whoever she married. If she married a Spaniard, they were afraid England would go Catholic. If she married a Protestant, they were afraid there was going to be a war with Spain. So this kept her from being married. Leicester married somebody else, a woman named Amy Robsat, and all of a sudden they decided that the stage was set for them to get married, that they could do it. So this is when she was pregnant with the baby that would end up being Francis Tudor, but he could never take that name. So Amy Ropes had died. She was pushed down a stairwell, and then they got married at I think it was the Earl of Pembroke's house, and they decided that the public was going to react with horror to the wedding, mostly because of a couple of people that were around Elizabeth would told her this.
Can I ask you a question in regard to something you just mentioned? But that was that the child would have the name of Tudor, but wouldn't the name of the child be the father's name, or was it different because she was queen?
He was not royalty the way she was, so he would have had the name Francis Tudor.
Okay.
In fact, that was one of the objections to them getting married. He was an earl, but he wasn't in the line of Henry VII and Henry VIII.
Yeah. All right. Well, back to what you were saying. Didn't mean to throw you off the track there.
So they ended up at this Earl of Pembroke's house. It was decided that someone else would have to raise the child, and that they picked the Bacon family, which for whatever reason they were at the same home at that point. The Nathaniel Bacon was the father. He had two other children, and he would take care of them in his will, but he would never take care of in his will Francis. The mother did treat Francis like she was her own son, but she mostly wrote to her son to keep Francis in line when he was in school. So, but both of them expected that at some point he would end up being king, and Elizabeth basically told him that he couldn't. When he got married, and it was late in his life, and it was practically a child bride, he wore purple. At that time, if you weren't royalty, it was illegal to wear purple. So, which is kind of interesting that he got away with that. Interesting enough, there's actually official records that they made it a law that anybody that speculated on the Queen being married and having a child would be put to death. And several people were put in prison or tortured or whatever for this, included one woman, Mother Ann Dowd, who ended up going to prison for suggesting that Elizabeth was the mother of Francis Bacon. So it was serious at the time, and the only reason that he couldn't be king was because politically it was just unfeasible.
So, and of course, this prescription against suggesting that the Queen had an illegitimate child was part of what you think was behind the secret of the Shakespearean plays, or keeping it a secret that Bacon was behind the plays.
Right, and he left numerous clues in these plays. In his other works, he also alluded to the fact that he should have been king, and he just left a lot of cryptograms in the works of Shakespeare, in his own works, and a lot of other things in the Bible. That he did the St. James Version of the Bible, and he left clues in there as well.
Could you give us some examples? Or
there's one page, and I don't know offhand, but if you count 43 words from the end of the page and 43 words from the beginning, you end up with Shakespeare. And he never wrote about, in any of the Shakespearean plays, he never wrote about the town that Shakespeare was supposed to have come from. He wrote about St. Albans, where he grew up. And so it was just a lot of that kind of information that might have been privy to him, but not to everybody else. And he had a quote about some things in secret will someday come to light, and it's kind of true. He also made a lot of made fun of his own name being Bacon, and he was part of the Virginia Company, and when they landed on Bermuda by accident, well, he got shipwrecked there. It ended up, they called the money that they used hog money. In Virginia, there's hog and bacon names, and his secret society that included the Rosy Cross Brotherhood was considered to be the something about the goddess Athena, and she had a helmet on that allowed her to become invisible. And so on the Virginia flag today, there's that Pallas Athena is part of their state trademark. The invisibility was also the Rosicrucians called themselves the Invisibles because they never really published a membership list back in colonial times, at least.
Now, you believe that the Athena is actually the origin of the word Shakespeare itself, right?
There's a connection there.
She
was the shaker of the spear, and so I think what happened in some of the stuff is speculative, but it's my sources are other writers like Alias Shakespeare and things like that, and they talked about when he would come up with these things, but I think it was Philip Marlowe or someone else that basically introduced Shakespeare to Bacon, and I think they probably had a great laugh when the shaker of the spear meant to them something in their secret society, and at the same time they meet a person named Shakespeare.
So you see a coincidence there. You suggest in your story that actually the guy from Avon was the literal Shakespeare was patronized by Bacon and his friends in order to have access to use his name, or?
Well, I think it was more a thing that first of all, to write a play at the time was considered beneath anyone that was in royalty. This was something commoners did, and the theater was not considered anything like it is now. It was as royal as cockfighting or something like that. It was not highly regarded, and so a lot of these people, they would find somebody else to be the beard for their writings because A, it was not reputable to be a writer for a play, and B, if they said certain things, they could end up getting in trouble. Shakespeare was basically illiterate. We have 4 times that he wrote his signature, and all 4 are different. When after he died, and that's another long story, but after he died, they found no books in his will. There were no books given to anybody. He never had any of the plays that he supposedly wrote, and so it's just he ended up becoming the kind of the outlet for a handful of men that did write the plays. Bacon may have wrote most of them, but there were other people that were involved that were in Bacon's circle.
So you believe it was a collaborative effort among friends?
That's right. At the time, there were 2 groups, and one was surrounding Sir Francis Bacon, and the other was surrounding Sir Walter Raleigh. And the people in Bacon's camp that I believe put together the Shakespearean plays, they would have a lot of negative comments on Walter Raleigh, and Walter Raleigh's group was called the School of Night, and so instead of just being, they were the School of Night, I think, because they met privately and they discussed topics that may have not been welcoming for someone in the church or whatever, but like in Shakespeare's plays, they would be called atheists and whatever, so it was an interesting time then.
Well, now, we'll be wrapping up here in a few minutes, but I just wondered, you've made quite a few assertions here, and I'm wondering if you can point us to some little-known evidence for some of the points that you've been making here. I'm thinking primarily about records. I know, for example, in your story about the man who would be king, the man who could not be king, apologies to Kipling there, you talked about the Spanish, what was it, the Spanish ambassador and his letters back to Spain about Elizabeth's association with Leicester, and that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about.
There were people in the circle that, for one reason or the other, there was a lot of intrigue, and one person that was very close to the Queen was a person named Walsingham, and I think Walsingham was probably the deep throat that was tipping off the Spanish ambassador, who was writing back that one, they think Leicester's wife was killed, possibly at the Queen's hand. And when someone challenged her on that, she said that she answered in Italian, she must have fallen down the stairs. And so she just treated her death like a joke. And so this person was kind of keeping the balance of power together by doing this, by not letting her marry Leicester. In Walsington's group, there was John Dee. John Dee, in addition to all his scientific efforts and being a cartographer and influencing the Queen to explore the New World, he also acted as a spy. And interesting enough, he addressed his correspondence from him as 007. And when he was sending something to the Queen, it would always be for your eyes only. And so there's a lot of connection between Ian Fleming and things that happened in Dr. Dee's court.
Well, certainly.
But these are all documented. The speculation part comes in when who wrote what plays. And one person went to Denmark for a while, and he was in the same court, Elsinore, that was described in Hamlet. And somebody else was in Italy for a few years and wrote the story that had already been kind of published by somebody else about Romeo and Juliet. And so all these things were taken by different people. So it wasn't just Bacon, it was a group effort. And the book that I mentioned before, Alias Shakespeare and Players, those are two great books if somebody wants to really go into the details about the different plays. I think it was Donnelly who also wrote the cryptograms of Bacon, and part of them, these cryptograms ended up in Shakespeare's work and in the Bible. I think it's a large 2-volume set that it's a little deep for most people, but it's very interesting at the same time. For easier reading, the Alias Shakespeare and the Players book are much better.
It was pointed out to me by somebody a few years ago that actually the kind of collaborative process that may have been at work in the writing of the Shakespearean plays is actually similar to the way a lot of screenplays are now written in Hollywood. It wasn't always a matter of one individual doing the whole thing from beginning to end, but a team effort. But
that's very likely. I think it was Marlowe who wrote basically the same person that became Shylock in the story by Shakespeare. Only when Marlowe wrote it, it was very anti-Hebrew and anti-Jewish, whereas in the Shakespeare story, it comes off as being that way in one way, but not as seriously bad as in Marlowe's work. So I think Marlowe's work was basically rewritten by the group and to become the story that it did.
A little bit more presentable there.
Right.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's really been interesting, and we've been talking with author-researcher Stephen Sora. And for more on his many ideas and theories about our lost history, we recommend his books and, of course, his articles in Atlantis Rising. And for more on all of this, check our website at atlantisrising.com. And Steve's website, by the way, is templartreasure.com. This is Doug Kenyon for Atlantis Rising Conversations.